All right. Good morning, everyone, and good morning, Northwestern Ontario. Welcome to day 3 of the Mining the Northwest virtual trade show brought to you by Canadian TradeX. And this morning, our first speaker is Jason Rasevych from the Anishnawbe Business Professional Association. Well, I always wonder how somebody fits those all those titles onto a business card. So, Jason, thank you for kicking off day 3. And without further ado, I'm just going to put it in your hands and looking forward to a great presentation.
Well, thank you, Kevin, for the introduction, and welcome to all the attendees for Mining the Northwest, and this being a unique day as Inclusion Day, co-hosted with the Anishnawbe Business Professional Association. I'd like to start off by providing a land acknowledgement for the traditional lands that I am on today. Calling in from Thunder Bay, Ontario, home of the Anishnawbe of Robinson Superior 1850 Treaty, as well as traditional lands of Fort William First Nation. And for myself, I'm a Ganuguming First Nation community member, signatory to James Bay Treaty number 9, and looking forward to honoring all of the locations across Ontario and Canada related to Turtle Island and all the Indigenous peoples where we are residing or working from today. On behalf of the Anishnawbe Business Professional Association, I'm really excited to be kicking off today. We've got a great lineup of speakers today with a few other of our co-founders, with Rachel Paquette, Jason Thompson, and Brian Davey also on the agenda today. And really the initiative and the mission of the ABPA came into play a few years ago when we recognized that there was a lack of advocacy and support for First Nations economic development in Northern Ontario, and as well as for Indigenous business within existing supply channels, and also opportunities that are forthcoming in different natural resource sectors, especially the mining sector, with the projected boom over the next decade, with the potential of 15 mines that are either in advanced stages or in the environmental assessment stage. So with the ABPA, we came together as a group of like-minded individuals that are all First Nations from the different treaty areas. And we are all working towards supporting First Nations having a greater opportunity in the North. Has members from over 100 First Nations in 5 treaty areas. That's Robinson Superior Treaty, Robinson Huron Treaty, Treaty 3, Treaty 5, and Treaty 9. So we also accept associate members that are non-Indigenous that wish to join our Northern Ontario Business Network and seek guidance and also networking opportunities with key decision makers. So with that being said, my presentation today, as far as from the ABPA, but also my role as the Indigenous lead for Deloitte Canada Indigenous Services, I'm going to talk a little bit about the legislative drivers that are moving the framework of free prior informed consent, social license, and how this is intertwined with ESGI principles, with indigenizing those principles, and how that could de-risk projects and support the mining industry to better communicate opportunities of their company from an investment perspective, but also community relations perspective. So moving on with the presentation, with the slides, it's clear that we're in a new paradigm related to development, and this from an Indigenous lens and perspective, going from an area of no recognition of being in the citizen minus era all the way up to the 1970s, where then we've seen a decade of firsts and rights expansions throughout the 80s, self-government and self-determination throughout the 90s, and then the 2000s with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's 94 calls to action, and now moving 2020 and beyond related to ESGI and supporting free, prior, informed consent, social license across Canada. So we've identified now that this economy and resource development, whether it's natural resource extraction or infrastructure development, will require First Nations as partners in development to move projects forward. And that has been clear through many decisions through the Supreme Court of Canada, and governments are working to identify opportunities to work with First Nation leaders to support some of their aspirations related to how lands are developed, how decisions are made, and how environmental and cultural impacts are mitigated. Some of the legislative developments that have supported or are driving this from a rights perspective are the modern treaties that are being negotiated. A lot of that happening out west, but there's a lot of opportunity for the inherent self-governing communities to move opportunities forward. And when I think about modern treaties as well, I also take into account the existing treaties and how there is a need or an opportunity to honor and implement the treaties in a way that supported the spirit and intent of when they were signed, of sharing of lands and resources with First Nations peoples. Also in BC, the adoption in 2019 of the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, free, prior, informed consent being the first province, and later with the federal government now adopting it in Bill C-15, and working with nations to develop action plans related to certain regions and areas of how that legislation is going to move forward. We also have Equator's Principle version 4, which was updated from an investment perspective that looks into accounting for Indigenous rights related to corporate social responsibility and socially responsible investments, and recent legislative changes to the Federal Impact Assessment Act, which has language in there respecting Indigenous rights and fostering reconciliation, working in partnership with Indigenous communities. The focus on social license isn't anything new. Related to the ESG framework, there's always been a challenge to impact the ratings of a company from an Indigenous perspective when a company is not listening and adhering to First Nations consultation accommodation protocol. There's been many Indigenous leaders that have stated you could have many permits related to land use, water, or aggregates, or mine development. If you do not have social license from the community, your project is not bankable, and it will not move forward in this time and day and age. So the social license is crucial, and that engagement with First Nation communities should not wait for a permit application to begin. The relationship building exercises and process should begin far before any permit application. And from a lot of the elders and the leaders in the communities, it's the thought that of when a proponent begins thinking of developing First Nation traditional lands, that they should start beginning to engage and understand the community's aspirations and any type of cultural impacts that may happen with the development. In social license, if there's lack of social license, we've seen many cases related to injunctions. My community was involved in successfully winning an injunction on a duty to consult last summer due to government processes of not respecting the community's aspirations on the consultation processes. And we've seen blockades and other issues that affect the company's reputation and could in fact affect their future operating status in a First Nations traditional lands or region. Switching over to some of the trends that are happening today related to Indigenous business, there was a report that was put out by the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business and TD Bank that that Indigenous businesses are 50,000 strong today and growing at 9 times the Canadian average and contribute over 30 billion to Canada's GDP, expected to rise and hit 100 billion by 2024. So when we think about Indigenous business, it's individuals that identify them as First Nations ancestry, and they are either an entrepreneur that's starting operating a business, or a First Nation community that owns and separates the business from the politics and starts running an economic development enterprise or a limited partnership structure. These are they're continuing to grow, and there's going to be more opportunity to work with First Nations from a business standpoint related to from in the mining life cycle, from the exploration phase right to mine closure. A lot of companies are being rated on what their Indigenous spend is, and there's more and more communities that are setting precedents related to impact benefit agreements or relationship agreements with mining companies to ensure that First Nations are involved not only in securing jobs and opportunities, but also business contracts within the mining life cycle, especially in the early stages. And the federal government setting targets, of course, for this for the procurement side of things, with the 5% target for federal government. We've seen certain provinces and territories set their own target. In the Yukon, it's at 15% for government contracts. So what we're seeing as well is in certain industries, they're looking to relate it to their sustainability and risk advisory, I guess, practices, looking to set their own targets for opening the door and continuing to retain Indigenous businesses within their pipeline. Talked a little bit about the economic development corporations, and this unique vehicle has been leveraged to advance some of the business opportunities that exist in either early exploration agreements or impact benefit agreements to support communities' interests related to operating a business. And many of these projects are successful, where First Nations are building capacity in this area. A lot of them are looking at JVs with existing companies and bringing in capacity building for their own community members to become subcontractors within projects on their traditional lands. When it comes to economic inclusion or economic reconciliation, reconciliation could mean a lot of things to many people. And within a company's policy framework, it's very important for mining companies to consider what their Indigenous relations or reconciliation efforts mean to their board, and how that corporate culture is developed throughout their company, and how they interact with communities. And this is based off of the TRC's calls to action number 92, for calling on corporate Canada to adopt the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, Free, Prior, Informed Consent Framework, and to consider these principles, norms, and standards in corporate policy and operational activities for Indigenous people on their lands and resources. So when it comes to reconciliation, it's important to consider this, because there will be First Nations that will ask companies straight out, do you have, what are your interests, and what are the ways that you're advancing reconciliation? Do you understand TRC call to action 92? How can you demonstrate that you are moving on that and advancing on this call to action? And companies that are not considering this, many times fail in their relationship building with First Nations when they do not have the cultural corporate mindset to be able to advance on some of these standards. Because these TRC calls to action are not going away. Many First Nation leaders and think tanks are assessing where government and corporate Canada are at related to the 94 calls to action. And until each and every corporation has some type of responsibility or action on this specific item, they're going to be, I guess, graded and rated on that from an Indigenous lens. From a business standpoint, reconciliation means a lot to Indigenous peoples related to business for many reasons, and that is for, I guess, some of the legacy and history that non-Indigenous companies have been reaping prosperity from the lands, territories, and natural resources from First Nations, where First Nations have occupied these lands since time immemorial, and that there is a reciprocal relationship related to sustainability from not only from a rights perspective, but from a responsibility perspective, from the ancestral inherent responsibility of stewards of the land. So where we see the social impact, there's more opportunity for companies to demonstrate how they are they advancing social responsibility within their own company, and also from a legal framework related to how certain provinces and jurisdictions are supporting that advancing reconciliation. And if a government or agency or ministry is not moving quick enough to advance some of these items, it's not stopping the corporations from working with the nations and putting language in recitals and certain agreements that support some of the reconciliation discussion and some of the content related to the aspirations of First Nations. We've seen many successful blueprints across Canada for major projects that are happening. We're not just in the mining sector, but across the energy transmission and also forestry sectors. And a lot of that as well is happening in the oil and gas sector across Canada. And we've seen, with the Mikisew and Fort McKay agreement with Suncor, where there's 49% ownership in one of the operations there related to the facility. And there was a recent announcement in September from Suncor, as well as a new opportunity to provide equity for 8 Indigenous communities, including some of the Métis communities there in Alberta. So they are starting to definitely become a leader in regards to equity partnerships with First Nations in that sector. Some of the examples that have happened in the north, the Wataynikaneyap project related to the transmission bill, also with the Moose Cree OPG agreement with where Moose Cree owns 25% of that potential or that opportunity that's been in play for a while, as well as the Alberta power line that is owned by a number of Métis and First Nation communities. And there's many more examples that are popping out of of this type of framework related to UNDRIP. The Clearwater Seafoods 50% equity of Clearwater by the Mi'kmaq Coalition, was a big discussion item and news story last year. We've seen the Oneida Energy Storage funded by the Canada Infrastructure Bank and supporting Six Nations related on developing a large project there. The Cascade Power Project in Alberta, which was supported by the by $93 million loan guarantee from the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corp, and then the Kias project as well with Manitoba related to that hydro project. There's a lot happening out west related to LNG development and pipeline development, and as well with clean energy and Natural Resources Canada's commitment to meeting certain First Nations goals to reduce diesel in remote communities and also look at supplying the grid with clean energy. We're seeing more solar, wind, and other water power, potentially biomass projects come on stream as well. Going back to the ESG side of things, and when we talk about the environmental, social, and governance practices of companies and how diversity, equity, and inclusion and climate change disclosures for board directors and CEOs are becoming more of a hot topic, companies now are looking to mitigate risk related to boards on how they demonstrate where they stand in their corporate social responsibility reports, especially from an ESG framework. And this is an extract from a report that looks at certain companies within the mining, oil and gas, paper, forestry, pipeline, electric utility sector on the existing ratings of corporate social responsibility on the different programs on the right-hand side. And you can see whether a company has a policy on UNDRIP or whether they have a JV with First Nations, equity participation, preferred hiring, programming, financial contributions to communities, so forth. There's rating systems that are happening within ESG, and there's going to be more of a process within the Ontario Securities Exchange Commission and the Canadian Exchange Commission to indigenize the ESG frameworks to include the I throughout, where the I for Indigenous is more important from a rights perspective and a responsibility perspective to just be diluted into each of these pillars, that it needs to stand on its own. And as mentioned earlier in the presentation, the only way First Nations in an existing ESG context could impact ratings is if they litigate a company, and this becomes counterproductive to reconciliation. So there's work that's underway now related to working groups that are looking to create a new standard for how companies are looking to develop and strengthen their position when it comes to ESGI, and how they could mitigate their risk for the corporate profile related to attracting investment, de-risk project initiatives on how they pursue opportunities and relationship building with First Nation communities, and certain modeling work that we definitely support to help companies make that decision related to Indigenous goal setting for sustainability of their operations moving forward. So a lot happening on that ESG front, and supporting First Nations and corporate Canada on working together to achieve an optimized scenario that enables development. Many partnership opportunities are available to work with nations, and there's some guidance on doing that is engaging directly with the community staff, whether it's an economic development officer or corporation, or a counselor with that portfolio of lands and resources, or mining or economic development, approaching band management, approaching the chief or the leader, understanding that each community has their own special order of operations, and asking the right people the right questions will help engage in that process in a respectful manner. And the universal standard of respect really comes into play here, of working with nations and understanding the essence of not having a certain timeline or restriction, and of moving forward with the development, because at times, and many of the times, there's a lack of capacity related to responding to some of the technical information where technical advisory and legal support is required. So many of the decisions that nations are required to make will require their informed consent, and until they're resourced to be able to achieve that position, and many have protocols to engage their community-wide before they could make a position or make a decision on a certain project, agreement, or initiative. From a retention perspective, we've seen many companies succeed in regards to developing policies related to having wraparound supports for some of their Indigenous employees. And we see many companies fall short of creating an environment that is open and welcoming to Indigenous workers. And, there was a report that was released earlier this year that 60% of Indigenous workers feel emotionally unsafe on the job. And when we think of that from an Indigenous awareness or cultural sensitivity process, there's many mining companies that are starting to build in this type of training from the board level right down to frontline staff, to understand some of the legacy issues related to residential school, Indian day school, traditional territories, treaties, the Indian Act and First Nations lands, rights, responsibilities, reservation systems, all of that information that isn't necessarily there in the mainstream education domain, that now First Nations are taking a leadership role on educating corporate Canada and the general public related to some of the past issues and legacy issues, and how we can move forward on that better understanding. And this being a part of reconciliation, is really important for each individual to understand where we stand, and for each corporation to understand where they stand in regards to doing that. So within the Indigenous awareness training, there's companies that are out there to do that. I know Jason Thompson, speaking later today, Superior Strategies, is very well positioned to do that for mining and forestry and other companies, and has developed great presentations and structures of also incorporating some of the local contacts and some of the local elders and First Nation leaders that could speak on it from a local environment, because of the I guess the broader approach. It's not a cookie cutter approach to understanding it. There is some general information that is easily, I guess, shared or discussed, but when it comes to the local context, it's always important to get a local person involved in developing these retention strategies.
And Jason, just a quick heads up, Rachel and Fiona are ready to get started the next meeting. So we've got about 2 minutes.
Okay, well, I guess in conclusion, ways to involve Indigenous communities, there's many ways to do so, as I mentioned throughout the presentation, of talking with communities about including traditional ecological knowledge within the exploration process, and as well as arming the process of an implementation committee within mine development, mine construction, operations, and commission. And we've seen that that being a key role within Indigenous communities, of having oversight related to contracting, related to having an environmental subcommittee, related to having key designated positions within the communities that work and build a relationship with the mining company to advance on some of the training needs, on some of the data needs, and that back and forth that's required to continue to keep the community informed. So there's many ways that could be put into an agreement, but there needs to be a will and also a commitment from the company to have that type of action and process within play. So I'll leave it at that with the next presenters ready to go, but feel free to reach out if there's any questions related to the presentation, or how it could be better supported within your operations. My email address is there. And Kevin, if you have any follow-up, feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Outstanding, Jason. Thank you for just an information-packed, little doubt that it's a power-packed presentation that you shared with us this morning, a very important one that it touches on a lot of subjects, very important subjects. So thank you for doing that. So folks, we have less than a minute left before the next presentation gets underway. So we need to close this room. And so we will see you shortly with Fiona and Rachel.